Welcome. Welcome. This is the fifth program and the last program of this semester in the 2018-2019 KHC NEH Colloquium, Survivance on Turtle Island, Engaging with Native American Cultural Survival, Resistance, and Allyship. The program this afternoon is titled The Politics of Language, Revival of Hebrew in the 20th Century, and Modern Revitalization Efforts of Indigenous Languages. And we are very happy to have visiting lecturer Sofia Lago here for the program. I'll introduce her shortly. I am Kat Griefen, a professor in the Art and Design Department, and the current KHC curator in residence, who organized this colloquium with Sofia and a lot of other amazing participants. This program is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities Challenge Grant, and I also want to thank Interim President Timothy Lynch for his support for this colloquium from the very beginning. This year-long colloquium will be leading up to a year-long exhibition. So if you were to come back here next year at this time, the new exhibition that will be at the center will be dealing with contemporary Native American art and will relate to some of the topics that you're learning about today. And that exhibition is titled Survivance and Sovereignty on Turtle Island, Engaging with Contemporary Native American Art. The exhibit and the colloquium are organized not only by myself, but by a whole team of collaborators that include Danielle Means, who's a citizen of the Lakota Nation, consultant Diane Freyer, who is Osage Cherokee, graduate curatorial fellow, or I can say now PhD candidate, Sofia Lago, and KHC fellows Barbara Kelly, Angelica Palmer, Julio Meza, as well as the art curating students in the Gallery Museum Studies program, and the KHC Community Committee, of which we have a number of members here today. Thank you for being here and for contributing. So briefly, just for those who are attending their first program in this colloquium, I want to tell you a little bit about the Survivance project. This colloquium addresses cultural survival and resistance of Native American and First Nations people in the face of genocide and mass atrocity on Turtle Island. Turtle Island is the name given to this continent by the Iroquois Nation, the Anishinaabe, and Lenape, the Native American groups who were the first peoples of this region. Not unlike the story of Noah's Ark rising from the waters, the Indigenous creation story tells us that this continent where we live came to being as a great girl turtle raised her back out of the ocean. The other part of the title of this program, Survivance, I want to speak about briefly as well. Survivance is active survival plus resistance. The thousands of Native people on Turtle Island who are still living, working, and even thriving today can be seen as survivors and change makers instead of victims. So that's where we start out our program today. And with that, I want to give a brief land acknowledgement before I introduce Sofia more formally. By acknowledging the people who were here before us and whose land was forcibly taken, we offer respect and recognition. In this way, we open our program with a small step towards restorative justice. The land on which we gather to work and study is the unceded traditional territory of the Manitok in proximity to traditional territories of the Lenape and the Shinnecock. We recognize the violence of settler colonialism that has forced Native peoples from this place, but we also recognize the history and continuity of survivance that is made for vibrant communities of Native American and First Nations people who remain today or have returned. So with that, I will introduce Sofia. Sofia Lago is a current PhD candidate in history at the University of Bristol, with her research focusing on fairy tales and language politics. In 2016, she completed her undergraduate degree in history and Holocaust and genocide studies at Stockton University in New Jersey. Her education and museum studies work has brought her to 17 countries and 3 states, including a recent summer spent working in Southeast Alaska. In summer 2018, she was the Kupferberg Holocaust Center's curatorial fellow. She was here working with us, and I can't say enough about what a pleasure it has been to work with her in organizing programming, exhibitions, communicating with artists, visiting with artists, and how much I am looking forward to her talk today. And if you'd like to hear more from her or read more from her forthcoming essay in the exhibition catalog that will come out next fall. So Sofia, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Hello. I want to say thank you for inviting me here today. I want to say thank you for inviting me here today, and in particular, I want to thank Kat, and I want to thank Marissa Hollywood, as well as CUNY's faculty and students. I want to say thank you to all of you for coming, especially on this day, so close to the start of Hanukkah, and so soon after Thanksgiving. Today we sit in a center built to memorialize the genocide of 6 million Jews, built on land forcibly taken from the Lenape and Shinnecock people. We've gathered here to look at language and identity as it pertains to both the Jewish people who reclaimed and revived Hebrew in an act of national identity, and two indigenous groups, the Taino of the Caribbean and the Tlingit of Southeast Alaska, who worked to preserve their languages in an act of resistance against prevailing American national identity. Hold on, I'm having trouble going back. Yes, there we go. Before beginning the actual presentation, it's important that I define the following terms, which I will use throughout the talk. Some will be more recognizable than others. First, to break down the title, I need to define that language politics are, broadly, when language is dealt with, how language is dealt with in the political arena, or at the very least, how it's dealt with in an official capacity. In the context of this talk, more specifically, it is the way that language is used politically to unify, organize, or criticize a group or people. The other terms listed on the slide are as followed. Language revival or revitalization refers to a community of speakers halting or reversing the decline of a language or reviving an extinct one. A lexicon is the vocabulary of a people, a language, or a branch of knowledge, or in the context of documentation, a list of words, usually with definitions or translations. Linguistics and sociolinguistics are the study of the world's languages, and more narrowly, the study of language in a social context. Dialect is a local variety of a language that is characteristic to a group of speakers. Genetic unit and language family is a grouping of languages that are all descended from a common language, such as the Romance or Germanic languages. Endangered or moribund languages are those that are likely to become extinct in the near future, one which children no longer learn. National language is one that is learned throughout a country, but is not necessarily the official one. Assimilation refers to the absorption and integration of people, ideas, or culture into a wider society. Extinct language is a language with no living speakers. Language contact refers to when speakers of one language encounter speakers of another due to trade, movement, colonization, or other factors. Lingua franca is a language that is adopted as the common one between speakers whose native ones are different. And colonization and settler colonialism are the system or policy of a nation seeking to extend or retain its authority over people or territories. More specifically, in the case of the Americas, settler colonialism refers to a large number of people emigrating to the colony for the purpose of staying and cultivating the land. Language hotspots is a term that comes from the organization, the Living Tongues Institute of Endangered Languages. It refers to areas of the world with a high average level of endangerment and a low average level of prior documentation. And then Taino is the indigenous people of the Caribbean and who were the first to encounter the Europeans in the 15th century. And Tlingit is an indigenous people of Southeast Alaska. And now the boring part is over. These are the spots where the Living Tongues Institute of Endangered Languages have thus far established projects to assist in Indigenous revival, Indigenous language revival. It is important to note that languages never die off. There is no such thing as an organic death when it comes to language. In every case shown here and those that are not shown, a language's death or endangerment has been brutal, bloody, and purposeful. The cultures and geographical areas discussed in this presentation, Southeast Alaska, the Caribbean, and Israel, are not represented, but the map nevertheless demonstrates that language revival is not confined to single communities, but can be done on an international scale. Of the three, Hebrew is both the oldest example of a language revival movement and the only truly successful one. It predates the founding of the State of Israel. It predates the Holocaust, which nearly ended it. Nevertheless, Hebrew survived genocide and the pogroms, or the scheduled raids on segregated Jewish villages that swept Europe as early as the Middle Ages, and then ultimately it became Israel's national language. Hebrew died as a spoken language approximately 1,300 years ago as a consequence of the Jewish diaspora, which was itself the outcome of Jewish revolts against the Romans during antiquity. After, Hebrew was replaced by the two lingua francas of the area, Aramaic and Greek. As the diasporic population spread throughout Europe, North Africa, and Asia, the Jewish people assimilated or semi-assimilated into the cultures of their newly settled regions, and subsequently developed new dialects or forms of the local languages. The most well-known of these is Yiddish, a mixed language that developed in the 9th century that combined High German, Hebrew, Aramaic, and elements of the Slavic and Romance languages. To place this in context, the Jewish diaspora refers to the dispersal or exile of the Jewish populations outside of their ancestral homeland, meaning Israel. The diaspora after the revolt against the Romans was not the first, but it was the last. And the death of the Hebrew language was an almost inevitable result of their new landlessness. Displaced Jews could not communicate with their new neighbors, many of whom were inherently distrustful of strangers, especially those who did not conform to social norms. They could not participate in political, social, or economic infrastructures. Mixed languages such as, again, Yiddish, were necessary for communal survival. Yiddish was also the language of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the late 19th century linguist who became the father of the modern Hebrew language. Ben Yehuda was born in the Russian Empire and studied Hebrew and the Torah, also known as the Old Testament, as young as the age of 3. While attending university in Paris, he developed the idea that the revival of the Hebrew language could unite the Jewish people. And so, after graduation, he, his wife, and their children moved to Palestine, then under the control of the Ottoman Empire, in order to do just that. Not long after his move, a series of violent pogroms swept through Eastern Europe, displacing whole Jewish communities, compelling many to follow Ben Yehuda's example and move to Palestine. The revival of the Hebrew language happened in stages, with the first occurring between 1890 and 1940. To standardize the forming language, Ben Yehuda established the Hebrew Language Committee, now Academy, to direct its development. The revival's main focus, however, was on the immigrant children and required the following 4 steps. School children were exclusively taught Hebrew in official academic settings. They acquired Hebrew then as their second language. They then used Hebrew, now a second language, outside of school, and once grown, transferred Hebrew to their children as a primary household language. This video is short, but it shows Ben Yehuda's influence today, if you want to play it.
He is actually the reason that we are speaking Hebrew today, and maybe even further, if we had not spoken Hebrew, maybe we wouldn't have been here at all.
There was no Israel like we know it today, but Eliezer ben Yehuda, he put his stamp on it, and not only through the language, also through his ideas and ideology.
Because of Eliezer ben Yehuda, we speak Hebrew and we have a modern language which we are able to express everything in this language. And even further, we can say that because of this being true, we are really an independent nation and we have an independent state.
There is no culture without language, and there is no country or no common ground for people without having a common language.
So this was actually his strange idea that a language which had not been spoken for 1700 years should be revived. He says that it was like a dream.
He was a person who really dedicated all of his life, his private life, his work life, all of his life he dedicated to being the person who wants Israel to become Israel.
The first step, of course, was that he came here with his newlywed wife, and they agreed to speak only Hebrew among themselves.
This house is special because Eliezer ben Yehuda built it. He was not able to come and live here because he passed away before, but his family was living here, and it is very great and a very big opportunity for us and for our volunteers to be in this house.
He himself, of course, knew a lot of other languages. Each item in his dictionary is translated into 3 languages: French, German, and English, and he did it himself.
All of our volunteers are working with survivors of the Shoah, and that is a very important point. So for those volunteers coming here and being able to talk with people and to learn from them and to hear from them what they suffered through, it is a very, very important message, also what they bring back to Germany.
By the end of World War I, only halfway through the first stage of the Hebrew revival movement, already 40% of the Jewish households used Hebrew as their first or daily language, a percentage which only grew as the population grew. In order to achieve this, though, Ben Yehuda and his contemporaries had to overcome the major obstacle that was how much, quite simply, the world had changed. Inevitably, the biblical Hebrew lexicon lacks vocabulary identifying modern technology, political or social movements, food, etc., words for things such as car, diaspora, or ice cream. However, between the Hebrew Language Committee, the new school's curriculums, and the dialects that began forming among the local communities, the vocabulary of modern Hebrew steadily developed into what it is today. The population, though, it decreased during and after the Holocaust. Many countries in Europe and the Americas, increased during and after the Holocaust. Many countries in Europe and the Americas, including the United States, closed their borders to Jews fleeing Nazi persecution. Even afterwards, their homes had been sold and businesses distributed to non-Jewish citizens, leaving thousands of survivors displaced. With nowhere else to go, many turned to Palestine, where Hebrew had already been integrated into the daily lives of the Jewish immigrant community. Max Zeldner, a grade school teacher in mid-20th century Israel, showed the effect this had on the population when he described how successful and how adaptable this language proved to be. Most people are not aware of the fact that the Hebrew of the Bible is vibrant with life and activity once again. Hebrew in Israel has now become the language of the home, the school, and the street, the language used by the driver to his horse and the farmer to his cattle, the language of the lover and the soldier, the speech of the doctor, the lawyer, the merchant, and the worker, the policeman and the newsboy. There are now among the million Jews in Israel people from almost every country in the world, and it is the Hebrew tongue as the common official language of the land. that has helped unify the nation and hasten the development of the country, thus enabling the infant republic to make such miraculous progress against all odds. Seldner was, by then, echoing a common Israeli sentiment. The revival movement had been fully realized by 1948, when Israel attained statehood through British and American intervention after the end of World War II, and Hebrew had become its national language. There were two additional stages to the revival movement. The second came in the 50s and 60s, and third between the 1970s and early 2000s. Particularly during the second, the movement itself was de-romanticized, as linguists and scholars began to question whether the revival was really as miraculous as activists of the first stage claimed. During the third, linguists and sociolinguistics studying the 1890s movement argued specifically against whether or not Ben Yehuda had as much impact as his contemporaries and linguistic scholars of the 50s and 60s made him out to have. The movement could not, scholars of the third stage argue, be attributed to one individual alone, but was rather the result of a number of components and teachers. But how dead is dead? After Aramaic and Greek replaced Hebrew in 2000 CE, and then the assimilation and language contact of the diaspora led to the creation of new dialects, Hebrew certainly fell out of favor as a household language. Regardless, that does not mean that Hebrew ever went extinct either. Learning Hebrew was a mandatory part of a Talmudic or rabbinical student's education, as it was necessary to understand the studied texts. It also undeniably remained a literary language in two forms, that of the Torah, the Bible, which was religious, and that of the Mishnah, the first major written collection of Jewish oral tradition and part of the Talmud, which was legal. As a written language, Hebrew continued to evolve, adapting to distinctive cultures that had developed in diasporic communities. Therefore, arguably, Hebrew was not wholly dead at the time of its late 19th century revival. Can a language be brought back from the dead, after all, if it still had a religious and written foundation? However, that does not negate the fact that there were no first language speakers, nor that the majority of the Jewish population could not speak Hebrew prior to the revival movement, which means that it was, at the very least, a speech revival. Hebrew as the common language was a way to connect the Jewish communities disconnected by dialect and culture as much as distance, and its success in that aspect was undeniable. It became Israel's national language over Yiddish, which, along with other pre-war dialects, have now become the ones which are endangered. Ultimately, the Hebrew language revival movement belongs to a more expansive movement that swept Europe during the 19th century, wherein nations or cultures under the control of stronger political powers used language as a way to claim identity separate from the ruling state. The push to revive indigenous languages, not only in the Americas, but also in Africa, Asia, Northern Europe, and the South Pacific, truly began and found traction nearly a century later in the 1960s, and corresponded with civil rights protests cropping up worldwide. Language revival efforts among indigenous communities were, and are, rather than part of a greater campaign to establish statehood, a way to preserve cultures systematically suppressed and vilified by colonial settlers in Western society. In no instance is this exemplified more than in the case of the Taino language revival movement, which largely sprang first from Puerto Ricans of indigenous descent seeking to create a cultural identity separate from one still based on American colonialism. The Taino people occupied the Greater Antilles. Their territory encompassed the Bahamas, Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and La Española, the island housing both Haiti and the Dominican Republic. They likely migrated to the area out of the central Amazon basin, as they show linguistic and cultural ties to the Yanomami people of the modern Venezuelan-Brazilian border, generations before Europeans ever set sail across the Atlantic. The Taino people were the first indigenous group to come in contact with the Europeans when Italian explorer Christopher Columbus landed in the modern-day Dominican Republic during his first voyage from Spain between 1492 and 1493. He established the first permanent European settlement in the Americas, called La Isabela, in the Dominican Republic during that first voyage, and subsequently claimed the surrounding islands, the islands which made up the Taino people's historic territory, in the following years. Within 50 years, Spanish conquistadors and their drive to expand the empire's riches through overseas exploration had ravaged the Taino population. Along with the Spanish came new weapons, diseases, and religion, and the very real and acted upon threats of genocide, rape, and enslavement. As a result, the Taino people, as Europeans and American academics assumed, and their language disappeared. This is not, however, strictly speaking, true. The Taino people lived on through their descendants. Traditions live on through villages throughout the islands, particularly in Cuba. Taino iconography has come to represent modern Caribbean culture. And in 2003, a biologist at the University of Puerto Rico conducted a study that revealed over 60% of the island's population had Taino ancestry. What had complicated matters, or more accurately, muddled the way Puerto Ricans and other citizens of the Caribbean islands traced their ancestry for years, was the Spanish-American War in 1888 and the introduction of American colonialism. Though Puerto Rico's official title is a protectorate of the United States, it is undeniably a colony, and cultural identity on the island became homogeneous. Spanish, as in descended purely from Spain, and mestizo, or a person of mixed blood, lost its meaning in comparison to Puerto Rican versus American from the mainland. The overbearing American presence grew as tourism culture strengthened until, by the late 20th century, reclaiming indigenous heritage became synonymous with protesting American influence. So the Taino people are not and were never gone in the way that scholars, explorers, and writers claimed prior to the late 20th century. The quote on the right, recorded from a Taino storyteller in 1970s Puerto Rico, strengthens that point. A man may not know that he is Indian. A man may know and not admit that he is Indian, but it does not matter. The ignorance of your father and mother does not change who you are. No matter what a Puerto Rican decided he is, it already has been decided for him. So if I did not have Indian blood in my heart would not beat. But what does that mean for language? As numerous second-generation Puerto Ricans living in New York, New Yorkers, know, being able to trace familial lineage, DNA, does not guarantee a knowledge of an ancestral language. Taino is still a dead or dormant language with no known first language speakers. It belongs to the Arawakan language family, which encompasses parts of South and Central America into the Caribbean. Prior to contact with the Europeans, Taino used a form of proto-writing called petroglyphs, hieroglyphs carved into rock surfaces. As with many indigenous languages, a result of contact with the Europeans was early dictionaries transcribing Taino words with Latin letters, which in this case meant the Spanish alphabet. Taino speakers also transitioned over generations to speak Spanish and, later and to a lesser degree, English. In Puerto Rico and Cuba, local dialects of Spanish remained dominant with English as the lingua franca. In Jamaica and the Bahamas, the reverse is true. And in Haiti, while the lingua franca is also Spanish, the national one is French. The Taino language, even before the revival movement, lived on in place names, Havana, Haiti, Jamaica, among others, and loanwords in both Spanish and English, such as hamaca or babaya. The ones listed here are a few of the common ones found in English. This video is short, but it is an example of a Taino language chant dedicated to their god of rain, sung by Taino elder Marie Crook.
Waili atabe yokahu. Boy Nael, Waili atabe yokahu. Boy Nael, Waili atabe yokahu.
Efforts to revive the language began in the 1970s as part of the Taino movement in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, when descendants of indigenous people in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean and of those nationalities in the United States united under the label Taino. After the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1992, the movement gained international attention, which inevitably led to sparked interest among linguistic anthropologists, social anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians to study the Taino from the pre-contact period until the 21st century. Critics of the movement protest that it is inapplicable because there are no pure Taino left, to which activists and supporters of the movement argue that if purity was the ultimate factor in claiming heritage, then no one in the United States would be able to claim theirs through hyphenated Americanism. Efforts to revive the language in specific were greatly helped along by the widespread use of the internet. Today, there are resources freely available in both Spanish and English intended to introduce Taino culture and language to interested learners. Universities and private organizations also hold classes throughout the Caribbean and the United States, particularly here in New York. And the amount of scholarship analyzing the Taino people, whether in historical or contemporary context, has increased exponentially. This particular picture was taken in 1919 and depicts a Taino woman with her children in their village in Cuba. The Taino movement emerged, as I said, at a time when indigenous communities worldwide were fighting for cultural recognition from societies governed by their colonizers. The revival effort, which emerged among the Tlingit community of Southeast Alaska, originates from the same global movement, but has its foundations in a markedly different history. The historical Tlingit territory covers the pale portion of the map, which consists of modern Southeast Alaska and the adjacent Canadian border. It includes Juneau, Alaska's state capital, and Sitka, which was once Novo-Archangelask, the capital of the territory when it was still under Russian control. It was the Russian explorers who first made contact with the Tlingit people, beginning in 1741. The Russian Empire colonized Alaska, and especially the southern coasts and surrounding islands, by establishing a series of trading posts and trapping routes. They created a barter system for furs, not only with the Tlingit tribe, but their neighbors as well, who had to rely on the Russian traders more and more as natural resources depleted. Furs were immensely popular in the Russian Empire and their trading allies, so high demand led to overhunting, which then led to a rapid decline in the animal population, especially in sea otters. While there were colonial settlements, they were few in number, structured around military forts, trading outposts, and Orthodox Church missionaries. Missionaries converted both men and women, giving them Christian names and teaching them Russian through the Bible, but Russian Christianity in the late 18th century and early 19th century still had a strong foundation in tool belief, the mixing of pre-Christian and Christian ideology. Tlingit converts did not often lose their traditional religious belief. That came later with American Protestant missionaries. Still, during Russian occupation in the southeast, The colonizers and local Tlingit tribes had a number of violent conflicts that kept Russia from ever fully gaining control of the area, the last of which was the Battle of Sitka in 1804. The primary combatants were the Frog, Raven, and Banff Island clans against the agents of the Russian-American Company and Imperial Navy, and resulted in a quick, decisive Russian victory. Just over 50 years later, in 1867, Russia sold the territory to the United States government, who placed the new territory under military control, a decision which led to a number of escalating conflicts that eventually culminated in the 1882 destruction of Angoon, a Tlingit village. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, an organization which had been active in the contiguous U.S. as early as 1824, established a number of boarding schools, as it had in the lower 48, throughout Alaska in order to assimilate Indigenous children, which included forbidding the students from speaking or learning Tlingit. The students were forcibly taken from their homes without their parents' consent, or were orphans from battles between the two groups. And through years of abuse and a curriculum carefully designed to discourage the passing along of traditions and belief, they learned to forget or be embarrassed by their cultural heritage. These schools remained active until the 1970s. One briefly lived example is the Haines House, located in Haines, Alaska, just 80 miles from the capital of Juneau. In 1971, President Richard Nixon signed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act with the intention to resolve issues surrounding Indigenous land claims in Alaska and spark economic development. Though the act was met with some criticism, particularly in that only tribal leaders and not tribal members were included in the drafting of the treaty, which arguably made it illegitimate, the response was overall positive. The area of Southeast Alaska by this point was less known for fur trapping and more for logging, fishing, and its canneries. One of the side effects of the act was an increased number of Tlingit-owned canneries, many of which were closed in the early 2000s when the state as a whole suffered from a rapid economic decline. Its dominant industries now are fishing and tourism, the latter of which appropriates images of totem poles and chilkat blankets, traditional of the Tlingit people, as a way to draw interest from tourists in the lower 48. And some of the chilkat designs are what's in the corners of the image there. Tlingit is an endangered or moribund language and belongs to the Athabascan Eosk Tlingit language family, one of three major language families found in Alaska after 1959, with others being Haida and Inuit, spoken in a small area to the east, and Eskimo Allyship, which is used north and west. In 2014, the official languages of Alaska law legally recognized it as one of 20 languages in the state. It is also the official language of 16 registered tribes located around historic Tlingit territory. As it still is to this day, difficult to travel between towns, often requiring long ferry rides that only run once a day, if that, Tlingit has multiple dialects that differ greatly from one another. Use of the language stretches from Yakutat to Ketchikan, the uppermost pale area of the map back here, to the lowermost island. Before the period of Russian colonization, the Tlingit language had no written counterpart. Tribal histories, stories, news, etc. were passed along orally. The first alphabet came about in the mid-1800s, written in Cyrillic by Russian linguists and priests. The first Latin-based writing system was created in the late 1800s. The current one was developed in the 1960s and has since been expanded upon by both Tlingit and non-native scholars. In 2007, there were 500 fluent speakers remaining in Southeast Alaska, most of which were older adults. Since the late 20th century, both non-native and Tlingit scholars, such as married couple Richard and Nora Marks Dowhauer, have researched Tlingit syntax and translation into English. The poem here, told by Tlingit storyteller Willie Marks, has been translated twice. On the left is it shows the way that best conforms to the English language. It was the great blue heron to whom raven egged the seagull on. Before his eyes, that heron swallowed it. Maybe it was a trout. I don't know what kind of animal it was. He egged it on. The version on the right is a direct translation, with the word structure left unchanged. The great blue heron it was, to him that egged him on. Beneath his eyes it was, he swallowed it, that trout probably, by the heron. Looking at the two side by side shows the difficulty that fluent speakers face when passing on the language to English-speaking learners. This video shows the Chilkoot entrance song created by the Daika Kawan dancers, a semi-professional group of Tlingit performers from Canada. The entrance song is a long-standing Tlingit tradition performed before any event featuring music and dance.
to Tiahoni.
So the 1960s alphabet was the first one designed for Tlingit speakers rather than non-native scholars. I marked the beginning of the revival movement, one which corresponded with the Alaska Statehood Act. The first dictionary, the Tlingit Language Workshop Reader, also corresponded with the legal precedent, as it was published in 1972, less than a year after the passing of the Alaskan Natives Claims Settlement Act. As listed, today there are a number of updated dictionaries, both in print and online, classes offered in universities and grade schools, tribal organizations and offered programs such as workshops and summer camps, academic works and research available both publicly and for research purposes only, fictional works written in Tlingit or Tlingit in English, and films and other media with Tlingit dialogue. 1,035 household speakers were recorded in Alaska on the 2009-2013 U.S. Census, which is a notable increase from the 2007 census. Sorry. This is Nora Marks Dowhauer, who, along with her husband, became one of the leading speakers in the language revival movement in the late 20th century, and who continues to write about the Tlingit lexicon for academic journals and as a teaching tool for young learners today. I returned to this photo again to show that the efforts to revive endangered or dormant languages are not confined to native-speaking communities. Nevertheless, that is where they start, and at times where they remain. Reviving language in each instance was and is a way to preserve and promote culture lost after generations of conflict and forced assimilation. The Institute is not the only resource working on a larger scale. Language apps such as Duolingo or Mango have added indigenous languages, such as Cherokee or Navajo or Hawaiian. Social media circulates online resources to wider audiences, though the information there is not always reliable. Within the last few decades, media using endangered languages has worked harder to get the syntax right. But apps and online resources, they also have Hebrew. Prior to the turn of the 20th century, Hebrew began at a similar point as indigenous languages today. Endangered certainly, if not entirely dead. Regardless of its pre-1890 status, it remains true that it is the one instance where, within 50 years, it went from having no first language speakers to being the official language of the State of Israel. It is the only successful language revival movement of its kind, where the revived language has fully changed its status from endangered or dead to robust, meaning it is used in all areas of life by speakers of different ages. Yet Hebrew is not just the language of Israel. In the past, Talmudic and rabbinical students were sent to learn biblical Hebrew in order to understand the sacred texts. Today, Jewish children are often sent to Hebrew school, an educational program separate from their secular education that focuses on Jewish history, culture, traditions, religion, and learning of the Hebrew language. These schools are found worldwide, wherever there are Jewish communities. Jewish children can sing, for example, Hanukkah prayers in Hebrew, and can often read and have at least some understanding of what the words mean. The tradition of attending Hebrew school began before Israel gained statehood. It began before the Holocaust, and more than likely, it's a tradition that will continue. Because what it shows is that Hebrew is integral to the Jewish cultural identity, even beyond the borders of Israel. Alternatively, the revival efforts of indigenous languages, in the case of Tlingit and Taino, while they are showing results, are impeded by the circumstances surrounding them. Colonialism, a systematic form of oppression, and ultimately murder that America, it is important to note, just celebrated, decimated indigenous population's lifestyle and land claims. Even before the common Jewish language was Hebrew, diasporic communities had at least dialects of local languages built into the infrastructure of their daily lives, something which indigenous communities lack. An inevitable but total result of settler colonialism is that when the settlers took indigenous land, they upset the language infrastructure. Info pamphlets for banks or doctors' offices and school registration pages, for examples, are not in Tlingit or Taino. They are in English or Spanish, with perhaps the reverse as the second language. Even the tribe's websites are automatically in the home country's national language. Language is an identity. It is communication. Language keeps people's culture alive. Whether it's Hebrew or Tlingit or Taino or Cherokee, Maori, Sami, Tuvalu, Irish, or others, it's important to understand that the death of a language also means the death of a people. Arguably, Hebrew survived because the revival movement began before 1941, before the Holocaust. It had died long before that, true, but the effort to revitalize it had already been put in place. However, from the indigenous groups of the Americas, settler colonialism, the driving factor in what led to the need for revival movements in the first place, never truly stopped. Indigenous land is still being occupied, and the use of the language kept in check, and the use of their language kept in check by the linguistic infrastructure the occupiers keep in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Oh, this is a little loud. So is there questions? I've got a mic, and I'm going to go ahead and pass that to folks who have questions so we can hear everybody. I'll bring it right over there. Just wait one sec.
Is Tlingit coming big in Canadian Columbia now, British Columbia?
It's spoken kind of, but it's mostly the Yukon and the Whitehorse area.
Oh, good.
It's kind of just over there.
Good.
Is there other questions? Yeah, sure.
Is it okay to make a quick comment?
Sure.
One of the things in your very interesting lecture, how you pointed out to distinguish between Hebrew and others, Hebrew was never entirely dead. And there's another major thing. Hebrew, of course, had an alphabet, whereas many of these moribund languages didn't have an alphabet until modern philologists created an alphabet. But there's a very interesting bit of trivia about Hebrew not being so dead. In the 16th century, there was a Jesuit mission in China. And the head of the Jesuit mission was a great scholar named Matteo Ricci. To this day in China, he is revered because he's a great scholar of Chinese. In China, they refer to him as Li Ma Do. Well, there was a Jewish community in China, in the city of Kaifeng Fu. The rabbi of the community died, but a high government official who was a member of the synagogue visited Beijing on an official government mission, and he saw Matteo Ricci walking in the courtyard of the castle or the palace, and he thought that Matteo Ricci, because a Jesuit walks in robes looks like a yarmulke, he thought that Matteo Ricci was a rabbi. And he approached Matteo Ricci, and they had a conversation in Hebrew. And the official from Kaifeng Fu wanted to know if Matteo Ricci would be willing to be the rabbi of Kaifeng Fu. Matteo Ricci then realized that no one had ever heard of Jews in China. And he realized that this was, he explained he's not Jewish, he's a Jesuit priest. And he sent his assistant to Kaifeng Fu, who drew pictures, architectural plans of the synagogue, and well, those architectural plans still exist. And the Bible, or the books, one part Hebrew and one part Chinese, are still extant. And so that here's an advantage of the fact that Hebrew not being so dead actually contributed to a great deal of knowledge about the heretofore unknown Jewish community of China.
I see you shaking your head. Do you have a comment to respond at all? Sophia, or shall we go on to the next question?
We can move on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there other questions? One of the things I was curious about was this. It looks like, following some of the timeline, talking about the two latter parts of your presentation, looks like some of the language revitalization seems to have been aligned with the same time as various civil rights movements or human rights movements, and thinking about the AIM and the American Indian movement. But I don't know myself and whether there's a connection. Is there a connection, or what are the connections between kind of the timing of language revitalization and putting down those oral traditions onto paper and civil rights movements?
The connection is very direct.
Okay.
Language revival became part of the Native American civil rights movements, and actually as those, as the movement began in the U.S., like as it swept up, like in the contiguous U.S., it took over like then in the Caribbean, spread up into Alaska, down into Hawaii, and then it actually began to spread into the South Pacific, so it spread outside of the states as well. And language just became part of that, because a way to claim identity, as Hebrew showed, like as the language revival of Hebrew showed, was to show that you have a common language.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Was there some thinking, like obviously you've made some incredible connections in your talk and in your research. Are those based in somewhat on any connections that you found in research, like certain indigenous communities looking at Hebrew and the revival of Hebrew as a successful example? Sorry, that's a little...
Well, okay, that's kind of an interesting question, because non-native scholars for a really long time liked to connect the Taino movement to the Hebrew movement, but there's no actual connection between like Taino scholars using Hebrew as an example. But if you like actually go onto YouTube and type Taino in, you'll get videos connecting the two. The only group that really used Hebrew as an example was the Hawaiian movement in the 1970s and 1980s.
Thank you. Is there other questions? I know we have a lot of students here too, so I'm hoping to get some student questions. Yes, absolutely. I'll bring you the mic. Great, thank you.
Hi. So how big a role do you think literature plays in language revival?
Okay. So literature is probably one of the most important factors, because one of the main ways that activists kind of garner interest in language revival is they'll publish like bilingual, like usually fictional works, like folktales. A lot of times they'll publish traditional folktales, and like one page will be in, let's say, Tlingit, and the other page will be in English, and it will be the same story but in both languages. So it becomes both entertainment, a way to teach culture, and it also becomes like a way to teach language, because it can be used as like a translation guide. It's been less successful in the United States than it has been in the South Pacific.
Other questions? Well, if that's it, I think that I just want to close with a big thank you for this incredible presentation. And I also want to invite folks to return next semester for some of our ongoing programming. We will be showing a film called True Whispers about the Code Talkers, a group of Navajo who put together a new code language based on their Navajo language that was unbreakable code used during World War II. And we actually have the filmmaker coming too. So please join us again next semester. And I believe we have some refreshments, so stay, ask questions informally. And thank you so much for being here.